Machiavelli has the dubious distinction of contributing his name as an adjective to our vocabularies to describe a person or policy that is devious, underhanded, deceitful, ruthless, and cunning, these traits being concealed under a mask of respectability and morality. Whether such a term is justified by the man himself, his life and his writings, is a matter of violent and continuing controversy. Was Machiavelli Machiavellian? Was he a proto-Italian patriot? Was he a peace lover whose writings, misinterpreted as the counsel of the devil, were really meant to be an exposé of the duplicity of princes? There appear to be as many Machiavellis as there are Machiavellian scholars. The devilish and devious advisor to ruthless rulers of the 16th century was gradually transformed over time into a proto-political scientist who merely described the objective conditions relating to the political realities of his time until, in the 19th century, based on his impassioned plea to Lorenzo Medici to rescue Italy from the barbarous dominion of the foreigner, he became transformed into a hero of the incipient Italian nationalism, rather like the enchanted frog which, when kissed by the princess, turns into, well, what else but a prince. Just what are we to make of his major writings, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy? Do we take them at face value? If so, do they offer different and perhaps conflicting ideas? Just as German scholars in the 19th century discerned an apparently irreconcilable tension in the two major works of Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, and christened this tension the Adam Smith problem, so too we might wonder if, in trying to understand Machiavelli, we come face to face with the Machiavelli problem. The Prince seems to be an exercise in realpolitik, a mirror of princes tract that, unlike the majority of such works, bypasses ethical considerations completely and confines itself to giving advice to rulers on how to acquire and retain power. The Discourses, in contrast, seems to be a work in republican theory, counselling not just leaders but citizens also on how to hold on to their freedoms. The easy solution of arguing that Machiavelli simply changed his mind is not available to us, as the evidence clearly shows both works to have been composed during the same time period, the writing of the Prince being a temporary interruption to his work on the Discourses. One consideration that gives a further twist to the question of Machiavelli interpretation is that, as with Plato's Dialogues, his two major works are not straightforward treatises, constructed and expressed in a detached scholarly manner. They exhibit some characteristics of works of literature, and, as with all such works, the question of what in them is to be attributed to the author becomes a matter of some controversy. As Joseph Fimia notes, like other Florentines of his social standing, Machiavelli was steeped in the rules of Roman rhetoric. Vivid imagery and an insincere, sometimes ironic, invocation of values or prejudices dear to the listeners' or readers' hearts were familiar and accepted techniques. No one expected every statement to be a literal expression of the author's beliefs. The problem with the use of irony, as all too many authors have found to their cost, is that there is a danger that some readers will fail to appreciate the author's ironic intent and get things precisely the wrong way around. Once upon a time, in a seminar discussing Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden to their Parents or Country and from Making them Beneficial to the Public, one of the students was asked to comment on Swift's suggestion that eating babies might simultaneously solve the overpopulation problem in Ireland while providing a nutritious source of food to those who remained. He replied, "Well, that might have been all right in Mr. Swift's day, but I don't think we could do that now." In the end, as seems likely, what appear to be significant differences between the two works may well turn out to be more apparent than real. On this topic, McClelland is clear and unambiguous. Are the two works reconcilable? The answer, he says, is a resounding yes. Not only that, but the Discourses themselves provide us with a complete political theory into which Machiavelli's treatment of princely government in The Prince can easily be fitted. Far from there being a contradiction between The Prince and the Discourses, it might be said that The Prince is simply one part of the Discourses writ large. A somewhat cynical understanding of the Prince might see it as part of a job application by Machiavelli, a selection of material from the discourses addressed to the Medici but not distorting Machiavelli's views. Both works are largely aligned on all significant matters, with the possible exception of Machiavelli's approval of republican forms of government that appears only in the discourses. Both of Machiavelli's major works are primarily concerned with the ability of a state to maintain its independence, and with that the safety of its citizens, so that a wedge is driven through the traditional interpenetration of ethics and politics. Reasons of state, raison d'etat, dictate that whatever needs to be done to maintain the independence of a state and the safety of its citizens may be done, regardless of ethical concerns. This radical division between the demands of ethics and the requirements of politics is, I believe, what is most characteristic of Machiavelli. That this interpretation of Machiavelli was common can be evidenced by the publication of Giovanni Botero's Della Ragion di Stato in 1589, which criticizes precisely this element of Machiavelli's thought. The Machiavellian influence on the Ragion di Stato tradition was fundamental, writes Noel Malcolm, but late Renaissance humanists searching for models and authorities in the ancient world found a near equivalent to Machiavelli's teachings in the writings of Tacitus. The idea of reasons of state, then, extends from Tacitus through Machiavelli and right up to the present. No one who has had the opportunity to reflect on historical and contemporary political practice can be unfamiliar with the concept of raison d'etat and with its importance in domestic and international relations. Machiavelli is commonly taken to be the inventor of the doctrine of raison d'etat, but this is not quite accurate. This idea already existed before Machiavelli. We can see it expressed as early as Plato's The Statesman, where the young Socrates is shocked by it. In its earlier manifestation, it was seen as something to be used in extremis only, and ultimately only for the good of the community as a whole. In Machiavelli, however, such regrettable departures from normal morality are commonplace and unremarkable. Machiavelli appears to be a political utilitarian. Actions and decisions are to be judged not by detached moral standards, but by results. The arena of private human relations is suitable for subjection to the normal rules of morality. Politics, however, is a dirty business, and here the only relevant consideration is the appropriate and successful exercise of power. Are we really shocked by Machiavelli's prescriptions? Aren't such political expediencies commonplace? Haven't princes, democracies, tyrants, and oligarchies always acted like this? Or are we really shocked by Machiavelli's plain and direct statement of his prescription? Many would find this doctrine of raison d'etat to be abhorrent, but not everyone. Joseph Fimi remarks, "No one, apart from pacifists, would now deny that deviations from strict moral standards are sometimes necessary to achieve a higher political good." Well, this does not appear to be obviously true. Libertarians are not, or at least not necessarily, pacifists, and they would deny precisely this, holding that the fundamental moral political principle, the non-aggression principle, applies to all actors, whether individual or agents of groups, including states or governments. When one examines the rhetoric of defenders of the doctrine of raison d'etat, one point that comes across with monotonous regularity is the allegedly unique nature of the state that allows it to operate in ways not available to ordinary people. Reasons of state is a full and complete justification for actions that we would ordinarily condemn as immoral or criminal or both. The state is different from you and from me. What you and I cannot do, the state may do with impunity. For centuries, the state has committed mass murder and called it war. For centuries, the state has enslaved people in its armed battalions and called it conscription in the national service. For centuries, the state has robbed people at bayonet point and called it taxation. So writes Murray Rothbard. Reasons of state cannot be accepted as a defense for actions that are instances of aggression. As Rothbard points out, the distinctive feature of libertarians is that they coolly and uncompromisingly apply the general moral law to people acting in their roles as members of the state apparatus. And that's precisely the point. Applying the principle of methodological individualism, we can see that there is, properly speaking, no such thing as a state if, by that we mean an entity ontologically distinct from and superior to ordinary people. The state is simply a name for a particular group of people acting at a particular time in particular ways. And the moral law, if it applies to any, applies to all, whether they act as agents or principals, on their own behalf or on behalf of others, and whether they benefit personally from their actions or not. The non-aggression principle may be stated as follows. No one may initiate or threaten to initiate the use of coercive physical violence, that is aggression, against the person or property of another. It should be noted that what is ruled out by the non-aggression principle is the initiation of violence, such as murder, rape, theft, or assault. Libertarianism does not rule out the use of violence in defense of one's person or property against aggression. The practical difficulties of telling the difference in borderline cases between aggression, which libertarianism prohibits, and the forceful resistance of aggression, which libertarianism permits, doesn't tell against the clear conceptual difference between the two. As part of your fundamental freedom, you have the right to defend your most basic property, yourself, and any other property that you have rightfully acquired. Of course, you may waive that right if you choose, so that pacifism and libertarianism are compatible, though libertarianism doesn't require pacifism. Although The Prince can be seen as a contribution to the traditional Mirror of Princes literature, Machiavelli is well aware that what he's doing is significantly different from the usual run-of-the-mill advice. In extenuation for his daring novelty, Machiavelli defends himself by noting that he wants to provide something that is really useful to its recipient, a sideways swipe at the presumed uselessness of much of this literature. And so he is not going to indulge in the favourite philosophical pastime of imaginary and ideal schemes of governance, take that Plato, but rather pursue, as he says, the real truth of the matter. Machiavelli is not interested in how things ought to be, but in how things are. This sharp distinction between the factual and the normative, predating Hume's famous distinction to much the same effect by some 300 years, is entirely characteristic of Machiavelli's whole approach. And now Machiavelli produces the kinds of statements that has contributed to his reputation for cynical realpolitik. He writes, "A man who, in all respects, will carry out only his professions of good will be apt to be ruined amongst so many who are evil. A prince, therefore, who desires to maintain himself must learn to be not always good, but to be so or not as necessity may require." This advice, of course, runs counter to the usual advice contained in the Mirror for Princes literature that counsels the prince to become a paragon of all the virtues. But Machiavelli is well aware of what he's doing. Other things being equal, it would be wonderful for a prince to possess all the virtues, but, as he is a man with all the defects that implies, this is simply not possible. That being so, it is important for the prince to avoid acquiring a reputation for vices that might imperil his rule. Note, it isn't important for him not to have these vices, merely to avoid their imputation to him. Any vices which might be necessary for the preservation of the state, presumably Machiavelli has in mind such things as a reputation for cruelty, need not be avoided at all, for, as he remarks, all things considered, it will be found that some things that seem like virtue will lead you to ruin if you follow them, whilst others, that apparently are vices, will, if followed, result in your safety and well-being. In a variation on the saying, "You must be cruel to be kind," Machiavelli, taking the activities of Cesare Borgia as his example, remarks serenely that if a prince has to be cruel to keep his state in order, that, while regrettable, is better than allowing rampant disorder its head. Cesare Borgia was reputed cruel, he writes, yet by his cruelty he reunited the Romagna to his states, and restore that province to order, peace, and loyalty. And if we carefully examine his course, we shall find it to have been really much more merciful than the course of the people of Florence, who, to escape the reputation of cruelty, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed. A prince, therefore, he continues, should not mind the ill repute of cruelty, when he can thereby keep his subjects united and loyal. For a few displays of severity will really be more merciful than to allow, by an excess of clemency, disorders to occur, which are apt to result in rapine and murder. For those injure a whole community, whilst the executions ordered by the prince fall only upon a few individuals. Machiavelli's political thought is grounded ultimately upon his own particular conception of man. Men generally are despicable animals, changeable, greedy, liars, and cowards. They will lick the hand that feeds them so long and only so long as it feeds them, and pledge all that they have to support their benefactor, provided, as Machiavelli cynically remarks, the necessity for it is far off. When the time comes for them to redeem their pledges, they will rather revolt than gratefully come to the aid of their benefactor. This view of man also finds expression in the discourses, though in a somewhat more nuanced way. Whereas the claim that men are naturally bad is made categorically in The Prince, in the discourses we are advised rather to assume that all men are naturally bad, and in an even more nuanced way that men are rarely either entirely good or entirely bad. When I was learning to drive, I was taught the concept of defensive driving. In essence, this amounts to driving on the assumption that every other road user is an idiot. Expect people to shoot out from their driveways without looking, drivers to swing out from side roads in front of you without warning, children to run out from behind parked cars, and so on. In making the assumption that men are naturally bad, Machiavelli could be seen, on one version, to advocate a kind of defensive rule for princes in his The Prince. The ruler should, if he wishes to stay in power, operate on the assumption that everyone is opposed to him, or is betraying him, or will betray him. To paraphrase Horace's well-known tag, we might say that, as a political thinker, Machiavelli odit profanum vulgus, he despised the common mob. However Machiavelli's anthropology is to be understood in detail, there can be no doubt that it is a dark, proto-Hobbesian view of man and his nature. There can also be no doubt that Machiavelli's personal experiences coloured his anthropology, something that we shall see was also the case with Hobbes. Answering the question of whether it is better to be loved rather than feared, or feared rather than loved, Machiavelli opts for fear over love. The reason for this is, once again, rooted in his conception of man. The bonds of love will be broken whenever it suits men to break them, while fear, Machiavelli thinks, never fails to motivate men, as they have a lively apprehension of punishment. To be feared is not necessarily to be hated, and Machiavelli advises the prince to avoid incurring the hatred of his people, which he can do very easily by keeping his hands off their property and their women. The appropriation of another's property is habit-forming, and the habit is best not started. Besides, Machiavelli remarks with some cynicism, men are more likely to forgive and forget the execution of their fathers than the loss of their patrimonies. Deceit and the breaking of promises are part and parcel of the prince's daily work. Just as Machiavelli believes that the mass of men are untrustworthy and will break their promises as and when it suits them, so too a prince must be prepared to do likewise. Machiavelli acknowledges that such conduct would be bad if men were good, but, as he says to the prince, returning to his central theme, as men are naturally bad and will not observe their faith towards you, you must in the same way not observe yours to them. And no prince ever yet lacked legitimate reasons with which to colour his want of good faith. Hypocrisy, too, is another string to the prince's bow. If a prince were to possess all the virtues, that might, not necessarily would, be admirable. However, much more important than possessing such virtues is appearing to possess them. The prince should seem all charity, integrity, and humanity, all uprightness, and all piety. and more than any else it is necessary for a prince to seem to possess the last quality. For mankind in general judge more by what they see and hear than by what they feel, everyone being capable of the former, but few of the latter. Everybody sees what you seem to be, but few really feel what you are, and these few dare not oppose the opinion of the many, who are protected by the majesty of the state. For the actions of all men, and especially those of princes, are judged by the result, where there is no other judge to whom to appeal. Here is Machiavelli's advice to a prince who has just taken over a neighbouring state. Assuming the previous ruler is dead, and if not, why not? Exterminate the remaining members of the Aust dynasty, for, as he says, a prince cannot live securely in a state so long as those live whom he has deprived of it. If the prince's path to power was smoothed by elements in the conquered state that now expect to be rewarded, ignore them. What are they going to do? There will be those in the prince's new state who will be, if not actively disruptive, at best sullenly acquiescent. What should the prince do with these? If some killing has to be done to get people into line, the prince should do it and get it over with. Better still, he should delegate the task to a subordinate who can later be blamed for being overzealous or disobeying orders if too much blood is shed. That way, resentment and anger can be deflected from the prince to his underlings. If the prince must kill, then he should kill quickly. If, on the other hand, he has rewards to allot, he should allot them slowly. The new prince should raise taxes as little as possible, and to leave the old laws in place. Good advice for all rulers at all times and in all places. That way, resentment is minimized, and the chance of legitimizing his rule is significantly increased.